Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday, the 21st of February. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. First, I'd like to say that I'm delighted to be back after a wee touch of the virus. This evening, we have an update for you on today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Free COVID testing will end for the general public in England from 1st of April, and people with positive cases will no longer legally have to isolate from this Thursday, Boris Johnson has announced. Unveiling his Living with COVID strategy, the Prime Minister has told the House of Commons it was time for the pandemic response to be wound down. Johnson emphasised personal responsibility for COVID in future rather than using government restrictions to control it. He said pharmaceutical interventions such as antivirals and vaccines would be the primary line of defence from now on. In a raft of changes, the Prime Minister said that people will no longer get free PCR or lateral flow tests from the 1st of April onwards. Some symptomatic people who are elderly or vulnerable will still be able to get free lateral flow tests, but the age limit for this has not yet been decided. The government said it would be restricted to a small number of at-risk groups and care home staff. The legal requirement to isolate after testing positive and for contacts to isolate or test will end on Thursday, although people will be advised to do so until April. After that, it will be a matter of personal choice. Contact tracing and COVID support payments for the low paid will end from Thursday, at the same time as the legal requirement to isolate. Schools and other education settings will no longer be advised to test twice weekly with immediate effect. Changes to statutory sick pay brought in during the pandemic will be scrapped from the 24th of February, meaning that people will only be able to claim it from day 4 rather than day 1. NHS and social care staff will no longer get asymptomatic testing, but it is expected that patients and care home residents will see this continue. Guidance on COVID passports will be scrapped from 1st of April, with venues no longer recommended to use them. They will still be available for international travel. The announcement of the strategy was overshadowed by a row between Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, over the level of continuing funding for testing and surveillance of COVID. A cabinet source said it had been a comprehensive victory for the Treasury, with funding for testing slashed from an annual £15 billion to less than £2 billion, with Javid agreeing to reprioritise some of his existing health budget to keep programmes that were under threat. Number 10 insisted that the NHS efforts to reduce the waiting list backlog in England would not be affected. Johnson also claimed the Office for National Statistics survey of COVID in the community would be maintained, but it was not clear whether this will be in its current form or a slimmed-down version. The SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford MP, said that the Prime Minister was guilty of failing to agree his plan with the Scottish Government and accused Boris Johnson of trying to divert attention away from criminal charges he was facing over parties in 10 Downing Street. Mr. Blackford said that the Prime Minister's plans were bereft of science and that they are purely political and made up on the hoof. Mr. Blackford later tweeted that today's statement by the Prime Minister had nothing to do with protecting the public and instead was all about the Prime Minister desperately trying to save his own skin. The First Minister will set out the updated strategic framework for Scotland in our Parliament tomorrow. Second booster jabs will be offered to those over the age of 75 and those at highest risk of severe COVID-19 disease following the latest Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation advice. To protect those groups, a spring booster dose will be offered at least 24 weeks after the last vaccine dose to adults aged 75 years and over, residents in care homes for older adults, and individuals aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed. These people will be invited as they become eligible from at least 24 weeks after the last booster with the first groups receiving appointments from the second week in March. Our Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf said, "We know that these high priority groups are at higher risk of serious illness from COVID-19, and I therefore welcome the further advice from the JCVI and confirm Scotland will offer a further dose to these people from next month." In Moscow today, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he will recognise 2 Russian-backed breakaway Ukrainian regions, what he calls People's Republics, as independent, an aggressive move likely to torpedo a last-minute bid for a summit to prevent war. The EU has pledged a strong reaction if he goes ahead with the move. Separately, Moscow claimed that Ukrainian military saboteurs had tried to enter Russian territory in armed vehicles, leading to 5 deaths, an accusation that was dismissed as fake news by Kiev. Both developments fit a pattern repeatedly predicted by Western governments who accuse Russia of preparing to fabricate a pretext to invade Ukraine by blaming Kiev for attacks and relying on pleas to help from separatist proxies. In Washington, President Joe Biden summoned a meeting with his top security advisors, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, could be seen entering the White House on the President's Day holiday. Washington says Russia has now amassed a force numbering of between 169,000 and 190,000 troops in the region, including pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine, and could invade within days. Recognition of the rebel-held areas in the east could provide a pretext for Russian troops to cross the border into those areas. Russia denies any plan to attack its neighbour, but has threatened unspecified military technical action unless it receives sweeping security guarantees, including a promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. Recognition by Moscow of the rebel region's independence would further narrow the diplomatic options to avoid war, since it would be an explicit rejection of a 7-year-old ceasefire mediated by Germany and France, and that is still touted as the framework for any future negotiations on the wider crisis. Russia has suggested that talk of a summit between Vladimir Putin and the US President Joe Biden is premature, saying the 2 leaders could arrange a call or meeting at any time, but that there were no concrete plans for a high-level encounter. The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said today that tensions over Ukraine were rising, but diplomatic contacts remained active, adding that the Russian president would soon address a special session of Russia's Security Council. These comments come after the Elysee Palace announced that Biden and Putin had agreed in principle to a summit aimed at de-escalating the crisis, following 2 calls between the Russian leader and the French President Emmanuel Macron on Sunday. The White House confirmed that the US president was prepared to take in a summit, but remained highly sceptical on whether the offer from Moscow was genuine. France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, who was in Brussels for a meeting with his EU counterparts, said he would hold talks with his Russian opposite number, Sergei Lavrov, later in the day, whilst the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, would also call Putin. Ukraine requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to address the threat, citing security assurances also signed by Russia, the US and Britain that it received in return for giving up its nuclear arsenal in 1994. And as we came on air this evening, Russia 24, the Russian state broadcaster, said that President Putin would deliver a video address to the nation at some point later tonight. Credit Suisse has been plunged into a dirty money scandal on Monday after media outlets reported the Swiss bank had managed accounts for human rights abusers, fraudsters, and business people who had been placed under sanctions. One person leaked information on the accounts, which were held in the decades ranging from the 1940s to the 2010s to Germany's Süddeutsche Zeitung. The German daily newspaper then shared it with the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and 46 other news organisations, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde. The Panama Papers-style investigations were published on Sunday and comes Credit Suisse, which denies any wrongdoing, tries to shake off a series of risk management scandals and a 1.6 billion Swiss franc loss in 2021 that has pummeled its stock. The New York Times said the leaked data covered more than 18,000 accounts, collectively holding more than $100 billion. The revelations also turned the spotlight on Switzerland, only a little more than 3 years after it began to ditch, under US pressure, a centuries-old culture of secrecy that had made the Alpine state a global, no-questions-asked vault for the world's rich. Even if the allegations are unfounded, this latest leak raises questions about its business practices and wealth management, and should tie up management having to spend time fighting these fires instead of moving forward, according to banking analysts. Shares in Credit Suisse, which had fallen by almost a quarter last year, were nearly 3% lower by mid-afternoon today. Credit Suisse said it strongly rejected the allegations and insinuations about their business practices in a statement issued on Sunday night in response to the consortium's reports. Switzerland's financial watchdog, the Swiss Financial Markets Supervisory Authority, FINMA, which rapped Credit Suisse for deficiencies in fighting money laundering in 2018, said that it was in contact with the bank about the latest matter. After a call from members of the European Parliament to review Switzerland's banking practices and perhaps to include the country in the EU's dirty money blacklist, the Swiss Finance Ministry's State Secretariat for International Finance said in an email statement that the country meets all international standards on the exchange of information in tax matters and on fighting against money laundering, terrorist financing, and corruption. It added that Switzerland was now participating in the automatic exchange of information on account data with more than 100 countries. Credit Suisse described the issue as predominantly historical, adding that it had received numerous inquiries from the consortium in the past 3 weeks and had reviewed many of the accounts. In the UK, the elections watchdog has urged the government not to give ministers a greater say in its work, saying plans to do so will seriously undermine its independence and could affect confidence in the wider electoral system. In a strongly worded and highly unusual public letter, the Electoral Commission said that provisions in the Elections Bill for ministers to draw up a new strategy and policy statement, which the watchdog must take account of, had no precedent in comparable democracies. The letter said, "It is our firm and shared view that the introduction of a strategy and policy statement enabling the government to guide the work of the Commission is inconsistent with the role that an independent electoral commission plays in a healthy democracy. This independence is fundamental to maintaining confidence and legitimacy in our electoral system." The letter from the Commission was signed by the full board, representing all 4 UK nations, with the exception of the Conservative peer, Stephen Gilbert, the party's representative on the board. The House of Lords is now considering the bill. Ministers have insisted the provisions will not amount to interference. However, critics and opposition parties have labelled the idea an attempt to neuter the organisation and to stop it looking too closely at areas such as party funding. In the letter, the Commissioner said the plan would compel the watchdog to have regard to the government's strategic and policy priorities and to help the government to meet those priorities. It would therefore provide a mechanism driven by the then governing party, enabling the party's ministers to shape how electoral law is applied to them and their political competitors. The Elections Bill contains a number of other controversial elements, not least plans to oblige anyone who votes in person at a general election across the UK or in local elections in England to show photo ID first. While ministers argue that this is necessary to prevent voter impersonation, critics say the plan is an illiberal and expensive overreaction to an almost non-existent problem, and that it could put off many thousands of people from voting, with some likening it to US Republican-style voter suppression tactics. Our Social Justice Secretary, Shona Robison, has called on MSPs to reject the UK Government's Nationality and Borders Bill. A legislative consent memorandum laid by the Scottish Government on the 1st of February recommended consent be withheld on clauses relating to age assessment of asylum seekers and human trafficking. Speaking ahead of a debate in the Scottish Parliament tomorrow, Ms Robison said, "The Scottish Government condemns the regressive Nationality and Borders Bill, which is fundamentally at odds with the UK's international obligations under the Refugee Convention. This bill will significantly change UK asylum and immigration law and will negatively impact people, communities, and the provision of services. This bill could have been an opportunity for the UK Government to create a more humane and fair immigration and asylum system. That opportunity has been missed. The UK's asylum and immigration systems are in desperate need of reform," she continued, "but these changes will not achieve the change that is needed. Instead," she said, "the bill will jeopardise the human rights of people for years to come." Following reports that Canada will push for Britain to tear up a ban on hormone-treated beef in trade talks this spring, SNP MPs have written to the UK Government urging them not to concede to these demands. The SNP's DEFRA spokesperson Deirdre Brock MP and the SNP Foreign Affairs spokesman Alan Smith MP have written to George Eustace and Anne-Marie Trevelyan asking them to confirm that they will not give in to requests to end import controls for lower standard products in upcoming trade deal negotiations. Allowing the import of lower standard food not only threatens the health of UK consumers and increases the risk of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but also threatens to undermine the UK's farming and food sectors. Commenting, Deirdre Brock MP said, "Although the Tories refuse to admit it, their extreme Brexit is responsible for the extremely damaging loss of trade we've seen, and now they are racing ahead with a deal to join the CPTPP in the hope that it will make up for some of that damage. They risk making further bad decisions and concessions in trade negotiations that could see the ban on hormone-treated beef scrapped, putting farmers' livelihoods and consumers' health at risk." Students facing financial hardship due to the cost of living crisis and rising energy costs can apply for more support. This week, more than £5 million has been distributed to help higher education students in financial hardship with basics like heating and other household costs. This is part of a £37 million hardship fund provided by the Scottish Government since June 2021. The Scottish Funding Council will meet colleges' further education student support funding requirements and have also provided a further £6 million for financial support for further education students in the current academic year. The Higher and Further Education Minister, Jamie Hepburn, has written to college and university principals, asking them to encourage students most in need to apply and to prioritise the allocation of funding to them. To further support students, Mr Hepburn has also announced a £350 loan uplift for 2022-23 in higher education. This means that the most disadvantaged students can access £8,100 per year through bursary and loan. Also, the introduction of a new 12-monthly payment option in 2022-23 for higher education students receiving the Care Experience bursary, so support is also available to them over the summer months. Mr Hepburn said, "Many students are facing higher energy bills and increased financial hardship as a result of the cost of living crisis. I have written to university and college principals asking them to ensure that discretionary funds remain accessible for students most in need, and that in distributing funds they should take account of the impact rising energy prices will be having on students, particularly those in private rented accommodation. I have also asked them to add students facing rising energy bills to the priority groups so they can access these funds. Students can also apply for support through the Fuel Insecurity Fund, which is distributed through third sector organisations." Homes and commercial properties across Scotland will benefit from the establishment of a new £300 million fund, supporting the development and rollout of zero-emission heat networks. Zero Carbon Buildings Minister Patrick Harvie announced the new Heat Network Fund at a visit to the Queen's Quay Heat Pump and Heat Network project today. The fund will support projects where the heat from individual properties is supplied from a communal source. Common in other European countries, there are fewer examples at present in Scotland, but those in place typically link up homes, schools, workplaces, and other buildings. This new fund takes over from the Low Carbon Infrastructure Transition Programme and is part of the overall £1.8 billion committed over the course of this Parliament to decarbonise how we heat our buildings. During the visit, he also announced the opening of applications for the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Development Fund and the extension of funding for Fabric First energy efficiency projects in social housing. The development funding will be targeted at small and medium-sized registered social landlords who have indicated that they require additional support to plan and deliver the rollout of zero emissions heating within their housing stock. At the same time, Fabric First funding for home energy improvements has been extended for another 2 years. Mr. Harvie said, "We have committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our homes and buildings by more than 2/3 by 2030. By the end of this decade, we aim to have switched from over 1 million homes and the equivalent of 50,000 non-domestic buildings from fossil fuels to zero-emission heating." And a new £80 million COVID Economic Recovery Fund, targeting support for businesses and communities, will help Scotland as it moves to a new phase in the coronavirus pandemic. Councils will have the flexibility to target support, either using existing schemes like Scotland Loves Local, business improvement districts, or place-based investment programmes, or individual local authority grant schemes. Councils will also be able to use the funding to support low-income households. In addition, a further £3 million has been allocated to the City Centre Recovery Fund, which supports sustainable economic recovery for 7 city local authority areas, including by driving footfall to businesses which have been hit hard by the pandemic. The Scottish Government will tomorrow publish a revised strategic framework, which will set out an updated approach to managing and recovering from COVID-19. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, met with business owners in Edinburgh City Centre to discuss how support provided to date has helped drive up footfall despite the impact of the pandemic, and how they anticipated this latest funding could further those efforts during the recovery phase. The First Minister said this £80 million COVID Economic Recovery Fund allows councils to consider the needs of local businesses, communities and households, and to target support to maximise economic recovery in these areas. She continued, "We know public health measures which were necessary to control COVID-19 have had a severe economic impact, and since the start of the pandemic, businesses have benefited from more than £4.4 billion in support from the Scottish Government. It is our aim to get back to normality as quickly as possible. Our updated strategic framework, which I will set out to Parliament tomorrow, will support resilience in communities across Scotland by outlining plans to prepare for possible new variants or other future emergencies, should we need to act to protect public health." She carried on, "Of course, the best way to support business sustainably is to act responsibly and to sustainably manage the risks the virus presents, as we begin to live the more normal life that we all crave." And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive and Scottish approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We really need all the financial assistance that we can get in order to continue with these programmes and also to do more of what we already do. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. We will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, hosted by Hugh, so please tune in then. Meantime, I hope that tomorrow, which is the 22nd day of the second month of the 22nd year, 22/2/22, goes well for you, and please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.